How did your Duke experience influence your decision to be an author?
Well, first, let me say, Shiyi, it's a real honor to be here and in the company of fellow Duke authors, and so I'm really delighted. Thank you so much. How did it experience? Well, I think most immediately, my experience at Duke influenced it most directly by shaping my career direction. When I got to Duke, it was in 1969, which seems like ancient history, but remember that was a very turbulent period. And I got here thinking that I wanted to study policy. Didn't know quite what I wanted to do with it, but I wanted to do something policy relevant. I came back after a junior year abroad and was sitting in a sociology class. I found sociology a discipline that I majored in it even then, a discipline that kind of was open, big tent in outlook, and you could do a lot of things with it. Wasn't too doctrinaire. So I'm sitting in a Duke classroom, and I'll never forget this because I literally had one of those eureka moments. I'm watching a young assistant professor at Duke in a research methods class, and he's putting up on the board something we call causal diagrams, which are X's and Y's and Z's, and you try to parse out for some outcome of interest what's happening, what's influencing what, and then there are ways of estimating this statistically. And believe it or not, for whatever reason, that was just absolutely an epiphany for me, because it was like, this is what I want to do, because it's sort of like, this fits the science, it's social science. And I get this fine. So I decided I didn't want to be a policy analyst in DC or not wonderful jobs, but I said that wasn't for me. I wanted to try to be a sociology professor, do work that was policy relevant, but not necessarily a policy analysis per se. So once I decided that, and that professor helped me, wrote my recommendations, for example. Once I sort of set course to be a professor, the maxim of the academy is publish or perish. And so short of teaching at a purely teaching college, you really are expected to do research, original research, and to publish. So that kind of comes with the territory. So that set me, I think, very much on the course of writing. Writing of a certain kind, though, you do very, when you're an academic, the sort of gold standard is a peer-reviewed journal article. And these are very tightly structured. They have a very specific format. You don't deviate from that form. You all see them. This is the ones that have the abstract at the beginning. And it's one of the things you do as a graduate student is you learn how to write this way. And I'll get back to that later. I like learning how to write that way, but it can ultimately be a little straitjacketing. So I went into graduate school knowing that writing was going to be part of it, and being very inspired by my Duke faculty. I think that Duke faculty modeled excellence for me. The reading lists were replete with books and articles by our professors. We were always reading primary sources. Unless you were studying something like Econ 101, you were not using textbooks at the time. You hung out a lot at the library. This would be hard for students today to understand. There weren't electronic reserves, so you literally went to Perkins and got hard copies, and you peruse things on the shelf. So I really found Duke faculty extremely inspiring. And to be research active, that's kind of the kind of professor I wanted to be, and to get my work out there. Because again, that was something that I saw Duke faculty doing. We did not yet have the Policy Institute, but it was just getting started. And you just were very aware that your faculty were out in the world disseminating their research, making a difference, whether it be at the medical school or in social sciences. Some of you all who are my vintage will remember maybe Juanita Krebs, who was at one moment the dean of women, I think, for a year while I was there, but she was an economist who was in the cabinet, was a cabinet secretary. So I think that is what really the model that Duke, of the professors that Duke modeled for me and exemplified for me, sort of set for me the idea that if I was going to be a professor, that I wanted to publish, that I wanted to do original research. That was part of being a successful professor. And I still, as I was thinking about this, I realized today that when I think about professors, I think about my professors at Duke and what kind of a professor did I want to be. Grad school is wonderful, but I had great professors, but it's a very different method of teaching. So I think that was the biggest thing, was inspiring me to go into the academy, and then exemplifying for me the kind of the highest standards of scholarship and publication.
And I was a public policy major at Duke, and I remember I took at least one gender studies class, and so this
Yeah,
brought back me to my own
right,
college days.
right.
And so I found those texts in the book very interesting. And so, kind of going from your Duke experience to your career as a professor, how did you, what inspired you to write this book? And what were there challenges that you faced while writing this book? I know that writing a book in itself
Yeah,
can be a monumental
yes.
task.
Well, I talked about learning to write journal articles because those people who are at all acquainted with the academy, especially the social sciences, will know what I mean when I say that journal articles are kind of the gold standard. There is a definite kind of bias that you should be writing journal articles, which I like writing journal articles. Don't get me wrong, but journal articles, not only do they have this very straight, straight jacket as you get older. They're freeing too in many ways because you don't have to make a lot of decisions about format. But it's most journals publish, at least in the social sciences, publish quantitative studies. It's very hard to get reflective or descriptive type pieces in a journal, and so you really find that you're writing to your colleagues, and there's nothing wrong with writing to your colleagues, but your most readers of academic journals are indeed professional social scientists. So one of the things that I was finding is that I was finding that a little bit, after a while, a little bit confining. And at the same time, a lot of the work I was doing was quantitative, and that was the appropriate forum. So when I think about the challenges in writing this book, I think one of the challenges was that I kind of have to think about this as a 2-book project. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my first book, Opting Out. That with the first problem that I really encountered in writing that book, having decided that I thought I wanted to write a book, that was important to me, and that I had a topic that lent itself to a book as opposed to journal articles, just because it was a relatively underexplored topic. And so it's hard to crunch numbers when you don't really know what it is you're studying. So I ended up with this topic of wanting to study professional women who had left their careers. And I came across this, all my work is in gender and work related issues. So it wasn't extraordinarily unusual for me to be studying this, but I came across this topic literally in real life. I mean, most of the topics that I study in gender, I'm drawing from the literature, gaps in the literature, things like that. But this was one that I was dropping my son off, and it was kindergarten, a play date. And the mom had just had another baby, and I said to her, "Great, congratulations." And she then said, "Well, this is her third child." She said, "Well, I'm going back to work." And she'd worked at a big bank, a big financial institution in New York. And I said, with some surprise, like, "Oh, you're going back to whatever?" She said, "Oh, no, don't even be ridiculous. I'm not going back to there. I'd never go back there. I'm going to go work as a receptionist at the local real estate office." And I thought, as I walked out of there, I thought, well, this is really unusual. And I'm seeing some other situations like this where women that had big careers and successful careers had a lot of supports in terms of childcare. These were not women who couldn't get good childcare. We're really dialing back, taking out, leaving the labor force entirely, or as in this woman's case, becoming a receptionist. Nothing wrong with receptionists, but obviously well below her skill level. So I really found myself attracted to this topic. I then tried to go get money, which is what we do. We try to get money to support our research. And this was, I think, one of the first big challenge I met, which was nobody that I was writing to, particularly, big funders, federal funders, so they would say, I would get these reviews back. They would say, well, there aren't any women who are doing this, or if there are, there's so few of them that you're not going to be able to study them. And again, I was doing more quantitative work then. So I really found myself stymied in that initial research. And I kind of kept at it, though, because I was so interested in it. And I thought, well, this is a topic that lends itself to a book format because it's under researched, and it just doesn't, it's not, it just did. It was a complicated topic. So I did get some support. I did a fellowship at Radcliffe Institute. Radcliffe used to be the the Women's College of Harvard. And they were seeing among their own alumni quite a number of women who had left the workforce. I think they were surprised as well. So they resonated to the topic. And so I got into it and did a lot of work while I was up there and came back. And I'm about ready to write my book. And this, again, is the point of view of challenges. This is a big deal for me to be writing this book. I'm really excited about it. And I go into the den one day, and there is the Sunday Times, and there's an article called "The Opt-Out Revolution," and it's all about why women, exactly like the ones I'm studying, are leaving the workforce. And nobody had touched this topic, nobody, except me at that time. And the person who was writing this article was the work-life columnist of the New York Times. So I thought, well, that's the end of this. I mean, I'll never get a book published. She's undoubtedly going to write a book. She'll scoop me. Thank God she didn't write a book. So I kept on going. I sped up my timetable and got even more funding to help, buy me some time to write it. And, the challenge of that was to write a book that I felt, had the quality of research and write that I wanted and that would pass peer review. Again, that's another aspect of social science writing, and that is not as common in nonfiction and fiction rather. So that was another sort of hoop or challenge that I had to get over. The other thing was that I was really interested in having the book that I was writing be readable by the women I was studying. And these were highly educated women, so I'm not talking about having to dumb things down too much. But again, I had really only done academic writing to academic audiences. So I knew I wanted to write what I thought was an accessible book, which is true for the second book, Opting Back In. And yet I hadn't really had much practice doing that. So I'll never forget to turn my first 4 chapters into my editor. I had a fabulous editor. And she got back to me within 24 hours. She said, "Pam, you're writing to your peers." And I was like, I thought I was being so loosey-goosey, and I was being very catchy, and that I was really getting this writing more expansively. I had a few people who were academics reading, "Oh, Pam, you're good at this." And then here I get my editor, she said, "No, you're not good at this. Oh, you're very bad at it." So I ended up, taking those first 4 chapters and completely recasting them. And I remember we can talk about challenges of writing. I think everybody has challenges in the writing process of finding time, but I ended up writing my entire book, most of it, at a wonderful writing room in the New York Public Library, commuting in every day to work there. And I'm sitting in the Allen room, and I'm just getting so loose and so free and flowing that I'm thinking, I don't know, this is like really loosey-goosey, but it was a lot of fun for me to write that way. And one of the things that people have said that has thrilled me the most is that they find the book readable and engaging and interesting. And, even non-academics are saying that. So that was something that was a huge challenge for me, writing in a different voice. And so that again was something that I was really pleased about, that it that worked. It seemed to work at any rate. What else? The kind of a similar issue with Opting Back In. Now, Opting Back In was a book that I did not expect to write. When I did the research for Opting Out, that book was published in 2007, which is 15 years ago, which even I can't believe. I didn't even think there'd be a follow-up. I was really interested in understanding why were women quitting? What was the prevailing narrative about it all being about domesticity and it all being about turning their backs on traditional notions of, new notions, newly forged notions of success? Was that just, were women just saying, to hell with having it all, so to speak? And I found out something that was very different, of course. But the new book, with the Opting Back In, whereas the first book focused on causes, try to understand the decision, this second book picked up on the consequences, because the sort of outstanding question at the end of the book, the first book, was the vast majority of women did not want to quit in the first place. They were eager to get back in the workforce. They were really questioning whether they'd be able to. And the book ends. I mean, all the women I interviewed were out of the labor force by design. So at any rate, with Opting Back In, I was thinking that, as I said, that I wasn't going to even do another book. So the first kind of challenge out of that was, could I relocate these women? Would I be able to find them again? Because as I said, I hadn't planned to do so. And yet I felt compelled to do so because the sad fact of the matter is that my book was still being used in classes. I was still getting, and it still is being used, thank God. That's not a sad fact. I'm thrilled. But I still get actually, people who will come up to me, or people who will, just write me cold and say, everything that happened in your book happened to me. And these would be young women, and they're talking about the workforce yesterday. So many things that I was hearing about from the women in the first book about the extreme hours, the overwork, the difficulty of combining work and family, the stigma that was attached to any kind of innovative efforts these women made to, to work more flexibly and that kind of thing. That unfortunately all those problems still seem to exist. And so the book was regrettably topical. And the topic was regrettably topical because so little appeared to have changed. So, as I said, I hadn't thought to do a follow-up study. I had some great graduate students, and I had the research associate who had helped me on the first book, who was available. And the good news was we were able to track down the vast majority of the women for the first book, which was quite remarkable, actually, given the length of time that had transpired between the first and second interviews. A few people said no, thanks, but no thanks, but most people indeed participated. So I didn't intend either, I should add, to write a second book. I thought what I would do is summarize my results and put out a second edition of the first book, and I'd have an epilogue, like a where are they now? And I'd sort of step back and, think a little bit and analyze a little bit and pontificate a little bit on what all this meant, but it wasn't going to be a separate book. But again, the reviewers, this peer review thing you have multiple colleagues, were coming back and saying, no, we think you should make this a separate book. And I had other commitments, research commitments, but I thought that I was convinced that these were by the reasons they gave for the book being its own book. So I ended up asking my longtime research assistant, Meg Lovejoy, if she would be interested in working on the book with me. And thank God she was available and was interested. And so I brought Meg on, and that overcame a big challenge. I think the book would probably still be being written had it not been for Meg. And we had we'd worked together for years, and we had a strict division of labor as to who's going to write what. And so that was getting over that hump. And then the final challenge I would mention is that in my first book, it was quite amazing to me. I kind of had maybe it was my 9 minutes of fame. I was on the Today Show. I was on the CBS News. I was on a number of things for whatever reason, because I guess there was so little research on the subject. My first book got a good bit of coverage, certainly for an academic. So that was interesting. The book was found, and it won an award. It was pretty easily. It was featured in a lot of different professional panels. So that was all wonderful, and I was thrilled. This book, I think one of my big challenges has been, and a follow-up, I don't think ever you expect quite the attention that the initial book gets, but this book came out in late 2019, and all the publicity and all the events that were planned for it were happening in spring of 2020. So we know what that means. So everything was canceled, and because the first flush of COVID, nobody was Zooming, right? If you had something scheduled, it was just canceled, and people were like deer in the headlights. They weren't rescheduled because they didn't know what was going to happen. So that's been a challenge with this book, is that the timing has been, in terms of getting the word out on this book, has been tough because of COVID. I mean, which I totally understand. It's just it's unfortunate. So that would be a sort of challenge I think I faced in dealing with these two books, and yeah.
Yeah, well, it sounds like you faced a lot of challenges when writing the two books, but I'm really glad that you overcame most of them, and really, gave us two really great books on this topic that are highly relevant, and I found were great to read. And you know, even though the events for 2020 were canceled, at least we have this one. So I'm very excited about
Yes,
this.
exactly. I was thrilled. Yeah, absolutely, for the same reason. Yeah.
And you know, I think tonight is a great opportunity because I personally found your book to be very interesting and relevant, and I'm sure many of the women here tonight would say the same. You know, that they would identify with many of the experiences mentioned in your book. That many of us have felt, feel, or will feel the sometimes conflicting forces between reaching our professional potential while making sure that our family environment is strong and our
Right.
children are nurtured and supported, especially in their formative years. I found that there were lots of lessons to get out of this book. What do you hope that readers will gain from your book?
Right. So a number of things. I mean, one of the things is certainly is true when you do this kind of research, and social scientists find this all the time, is that most of us have a kind of psychological understanding, and this is not a criticism. It's just the way, you know, we're in a me culture. That's the way we tend to see the world. It's something about me, and so whether I was talking to women about why they had quit, or when I was talking and hearing about the lack of confidence they were feeling as they thought about going back, the lack of direction they felt. A lot of women feel this is just me. It's just me. I can't. I'm a perfectionist. I can't cope with, you know, with this demanding job. But it's just me. It's only I who, you know, other people are going to be soldiering on. Only I am lacking in confidence. And what you hope in a book like this is that it's never just me. You know, one of the amazing things about, you know, doing this kind of research is to see the patterns fall out. And it extends even to women saying this exact same thing. And I'm talking about women who don't know each other, who are across the country from each other. One of the things I heard all about a lot was, it's just me. I'm a perfectionist. That was a big thing. Or it's just me. You know, I don't know what I want to do. Other people, can figure it out. But I don't know. It's just me. And it's never just you, as I said. And so that's one thing I think that a book like this can do, is it can tell women it's not just you. They can provide a larger context for your what's happening to you, making sense of what's happening to you. I think based on, because I do get a lot of feedback, relatively speaking, from, you know, as I said, readers, women who are like the women I profile in the book, not students, but real people have picked it up for other reasons. And you know, I think that women do identify with the women that I studied. And I think that is always very gratifying for me, that hopefully implicitly, you know, that this is not an advice book, right? I don't really give them. One of the questions I will maybe get to later on is about tips. I'm happy to give tips. I think tips can be drawn from the book, but it's more, those tips are more implicit than explicit. And so I think, as I said, that as sociologists, we like to provide perspective, we like to provide context, and sometimes we like to provide, you know, kind of a skeptical look. So, you know, one of the things in this book is that, opting back in, is that, you know, on the one hand, women are doing very well, right? These are very privileged women, to be clear about it. These are women who have a lot of resources, but even with all their resources, they've had a very hard time navigating the demands of the kinds of jobs that they're in. And they're in the kind of jobs that high achieving women are channeled into by high achieving, you know, colleges and universities, and likely very familiar to everybody who's listening. So, you know, there's a lot of good news in this story that I find, that women are able, despite it taking often a very long time, and there being a lot of sort of being in the dark, being in the woods, women are able to eventually, who want to get back to work, are able to eventually find what they want to do and figure out a way to do it. And they talk about being very happy in their new careers, although it often, as I said, takes a long time to get to them. So there's a lot of positive outcomes. There's a kind of half full, half empty situation, perhaps. And there's a lot of generative talk on the part of the women themselves about this being a new chapter, about seeing this as reinvention. And I think all those are good things. It is great to be able to reinvent. But I think the generative talk about reinvention and new chapters, you know, shouldn't obscure the real loss that these women and the real costs that they bear, because by being unable to continue with the careers for which they initially trained, there's arguably a loss of those skills and training in human capital. As those of you who have read the book will find out, a lot of women completely throw over their former careers. They're oftentimes pretty disillusioned with them, actually, feel they've been pretty shabbily treated. And so they really start over. And so that's tough. That's hard. And I don't think we should only frame that in a positive light. We have to see it also as having real costs and being negative as well. So in that sense, I want women to see themselves in context, but I also want them to recognize the challenges of this opting out strategy, and that even for very savvy and fortunate women, it can be hard to get back. It's not an easy process by any stretch. And I also want, for women like the ones I study, for them to sort of locate themselves vis-a-vis other women who are less privileged, which I think they're very good about doing. I think the women I studied are very conscious of just how much advantage they have. So they hesitate to complain. That's one of the problems. They hesitate to complain. So I want them to sort of see how limited their options in some ways really are. And certainly compared to their male counterparts, their careers are clearly taking a hit, taking a back seat. You see the dynamics play out over and over again. The long hours at work, the intensive demands of childbearing and the upper middle class. This pandemic, as so many people have noted, is just ridding that large, right? I mean, it's just quite amazing to see these gender differences of who does what at home, which again come out very much in the book. So I guess I want that readers to locate themselves vis-a-vis other women. I want them to see that in making choices that are very good for them, making decisions that are very good for them, to, for example, leave investment banking and become a teacher. That's a wonderful thing. But unfortunately, what that means is that a woman is moving from a male-dominated profession, which she has helped to integrate, to a female-dominated profession, which is highly segregated. She's moving from a very high-paying and prestigious position to a position which, regrettably, is low-paying and not as prestigious and sadly, not as valued. So women making what decisions that work for them are also ending up creating, in the aggregate, more gender inequality. And why do they do that? They do that because, again, their options are much more limited than even they realize. That to try for these women to go back to work and just have some semblance of a family life, for example, means that they usually cannot go back to whence they came. And they have to find more family-friendly jobs, which historically female-dominated jobs have been, but they're also lower paying. So there's that tension too, and I want people to sort of see that big picture. And I guess I want kind of a hint at this. I want women to get mad. I want these women especially to get mad. I want them to push back against this idea that opting out is a solution. It's not a solution. It's a way of not only, losing out, to male counterparts. It's also a real loss based on their long-term investments, their long-term sense of who they are and a sense of identity.